January 1991. Iraqi MiG-29s and Su-24s turned east, engines carrying them across the Iranian border. Iraq had only just ended an 8-year war with Iran. The coalition flew more than 100,000 combat sorties in 6 weeks. It dropped 88,000 tons of munitions. Airfields faced destruction from above. Commanders chose the flight. 137 aircraft escaped into Iran. MiG-29s, Mirage F1s, Su-24s, and Su-25s. 36 Iraqi aircraft fell in aerial combat. Iraqi air defenses brought down 1 coalition fighter. Within days, the world's 4th largest air force had stopped being a fighting force. Before Iraqi jets fled east, British instructors had built the force around open cockpit biplanes. Iraq stood under British administration after the First World War. Britain created the Royal Iraqi Air Force in 1931. It followed the Royal Air Force model. British factories supplied its aircraft. British instructors trained its pilots. Its early task was air patrol. Roads ended beyond many settlements, while ground columns cost more and moved slower. Gypsy Moths, Dragons, and Hawker Audax biplanes crossed those distant tribal areas. Engine noise carried over the roadless land. In its first years, Iraqi aviation remained British in aircraft, training, and mission. 1932 gave Baghdad formal independence. British instructors remained, and Baghdad kept buying British aircraft it could afford. Through the 30s and 40s, Iraqi crews still trained under British influence. In 1941, nationalist officers seized power and drew close to the Axis powers. They tried to force British troops out of Iraq. The Royal Air Force still held bases it had not evacuated. Aircraft lifted from those fields. Flashes broke across Iraqi airfields. Within weeks, British crews destroyed Iraqi aircraft in the air and on the ground. The entire crisis lasted less than a month. Iraq rebuilt its air force afterward. Britain then supervised it more closely than before. British oversight faced its first major test in 1948, when Iraq sent aircraft into the war around newly declared Israel. Arab neighbors had attacked the new state. Iraq dispatched only a small contingent. Its Avro Ansons and Hawker Furies faced Israeli Spitfires and other fighters. The Iraqi aircraft were poorly suited to air combat. Engines droned. Short bursts cut across the sky. Losses mattered because Iraq had sent so few planes. The detachment could not absorb losses without shrinking its already limited presence. The encounter exposed a gap Iraq could measure in combat, not training reports. As oil revenues grew in the early 1950s, Baghdad sought newer aircraft. The effort continued for 4 decades. The lesson came from the skies of 1948. Those losses pushed Iraq toward a larger air arm, but training and supply pulled in different directions. Oil revenue funded new aircraft in the early 1950s. DHC-1 trainers, Percival Provosts, and North American T-6 aircraft filled the airfields. Then came the de Havilland Vampire, Iraq's first jet. Venoms and Hawker Hunters followed, yet the political break arrived in July 1958. The revolution removed the Hashemite monarchy and created the Republic of Iraq. British instructors left the country. The new government opened military and diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union, and Soviet aircraft began arriving within a few years. The transition stayed incomplete. Early 1960 squadrons flew Hawker Hunters beside MiG-17s and MiG-19s, with different parts, manuals, and supply routes. Maintenance crews faced 2 aircraft families on the same airfield. Parts no longer matched. The 1963 coup briefly turned Baghdad back toward Western powers and brought additional Hunters from British stocks. That reversal did not last. After the Baathists consolidated power and ties with Moscow stabilized, Soviet deliveries resumed. British aircraft gradually disappeared from Iraqi service. By 1966, Iraq had received the MiG-21, its first modern aircraft. a supersonic interceptor. On paper, it could challenge Israeli Mirages and Mystirs. Israeli crews had years of Western aircraft and Western training behind them. Aircraft did not close that gap. Iraq sent planes and pilots to Egypt and Syria in 1967 and 1973. In the opening hours of the Six-Day War, Israeli strikes destroyed most Arab aircraft on the ground. The Iraqi contingent reaching Egypt lost aircraft to Israeli fighters. Little came back. In 1973, Iraqi Hawker hunters flew toward the Golan Heights. Israeli F-4 Phantoms met them there. Iraqi losses remained heavy. Those losses exposed a deeper problem. Iraq needed aircraft, parts, and trained crews. In 1979, Saddam Hussein consolidated power and directed rising oil revenues into new purchases. The price shock of 1973 had swollen Iraq's oil income. Within a decade, its air force became the largest in the Arab world. The Soviet Union remained Baghdad's main supplier, but Egypt had lost access to Soviet spare parts after turning toward the United States in the mid-1970s. Iraq bought from France as well. Mirage F1 deliveries began in 1981, while the Soviets supplied the Se-20, Se-22, MiG-25, and later MiG-29. Different aircraft brought different needs. Pilots trained at once in the Soviet Union, France, and Iraq. Their qualifications did not match. The fleet expanded faster than its crews could reach the same standard. Those uneven crews now had to support a fleet assembled from two foreign suppliers. By the late 1980s, Iraqi airfields held more than 1,000 aircraft of every type. Only about 550 were ready for combat. The Air Force listed 2 bomber squadrons, 11 fighter ground attack squadrons, and 5 interceptor squadrons. 40,000 personnel served across the force. In 1987, 24 MiG-29s arrived from the Soviet Union. Moscow had previously sent the type only to Syria and India. These were the most capable fighters the Soviets had exported to an Arab state. 2 22 Blinder bombers stood nearby. Aircraft Libya had also operated. Large numbers of Mirage F1s came in several versions. Some carried Exocet anti-ship missiles for maritime strikes. Each aircraft family required its own parts, maintenance routines, and trained crews. Soviet advisors stressed rigid procedures. Crews received less training than their Western equivalents. One flight line, different procedures, separate deliveries. About 550 aircraft were combat-ready from more than 1,000, dependent on separate Soviet and French supply chains. The fleet could not provide cover when the war began. Iraq flew fewer than 80 sorties on its first day. The war opened in September 1980. Saddam expected it to end quickly. His Air Force was meant to force that outcome. Then, Operation Kaman 99 struck on September 22nd. Iran sent about 200 aircraft against Iraqi air bases and infrastructure across the country. Iranian aircraft roared toward targets Iraq expected to control. Iran lost 24 aircraft. Iraq lost 40. 11 Iraqi air bases suffered heavy damage. Iranian crews flew despite purges, spare parts shortages, and limited training on their strongest aircraft. Iraq still failed to answer at the expected scale. Fewer than 80 sorties left Iraqi runways that day. Ground offensives needed air cover. They often waited for it. Some attacks stalled when aircraft arrived late or did not arrive at all. Iraqi training followed Soviet procedures closely. When a fight changed outside familiar patterns, pilots chose caution. They broke off engagements. They returned to base. Missions remained unfinished. Ground units waited for cover. Over the Persian Gulf, Iraqi crews faced lone ships and oil facilities. The campaign began in 1981. It intensified by the middle of the decade. Mirage F1 and MiG-23 crews carried Exocet anti-ship missiles. They approached across the water, launched from range, then turned away. Sunlight flashed below the aircraft. France also leased Iraq 5 Super Étendards from its naval aviation. These strikes demanded less improvisation than air combat. The target had already been chosen. Iraq aimed at Iranian oil infrastructure and shipping, causing economic damage. Iraq carried out 283 attacks on shipping. One radar contact changed the target. On May 17, 1987, an Iraqi pilot on patrol in the Persian Gulf read it as an Iranian vessel. He fired 2 Exocet missiles. They struck the American frigate USS Stark. Both missiles hit. 37 sailors died. The aircraft was not a Mirage F1. Iraq had modified a Falcon 50 business jet and fitted it with Mirage fire control equipment. Weapons used against tankers had struck an Allied warship after a mistaken identification. Iraq apologized at once. Its statement called the strike a tragic accident. That apology did not leave Iraq with a smaller air arm. By 1988, its inventory had grown despite 8 years of war. Iraqi bombing struck Iranian cities and infrastructure during the War of the Cities, while the tanker war added economic pressure on Tehran. The pressure came at a cost. Estimates place Iraqi aircraft losses between about 250 and more than 400. They include combat losses, accidents, and operational attrition. The Mirage F1 fleet alone lost 33 aircraft. MiG-29s arrived in 1987, took off rarely, and Iraqi commanders used them sparingly in the war's final phase. They also recorded kills against Iranian aircraft. The Soviet Union and France replaced the losses with more aircraft. Iraq ended the war with a larger fleet than it had started with. But more airframes did not repair pilot training or decision-making in the air. After 8 years of fighting, those failures remained. The weaknesses exposed over Iran mattered immediately. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait after 8 years of air war. This time, it faced American Air Force and Navy aircraft alongside the Royal Air Force and French Air Force. They arrived with newer aircraft and weapons. The air campaign began on January 17, 1991. During its first 24 hours, F-117 aircraft struck Iraqi Air Defense Command nodes. The attacks cut the links between radar stations and surface-to-air missile batteries. Screens still glowed, but each battery saw targets only inside its own radar coverage. That changed the fight at once. A battery could fire locally, but it could no longer share a wider picture or coordinate engagements. Coalition planners now faced isolated radar zones instead of a connected defense. Within days, coalition aircraft controlled Iraq's skies. F-117 strikes had cut the coordination from Iraq's air defenses. With Iraq's defenses reduced to separate radar zones, the Air Force lost control of its response. In the opening days, Iraqi pilots still launched against coalition formations. 36 Iraqi aircraft fell in air-to-air combat. The coalition lost 1 fighter, an FA-18 flown by U.S. Navy Commander Scott Spiker. The exchanges ended quickly. Iraq could no longer direct its aircraft as one force. On January 25th, coalition early warning crews watched Iraqi jets cross the Iranian border. Over the following weeks, 137 aircraft arrived there. The group included 24 Mirage F1 fighters, 40 Su-22 aircraft, 24 Su-24 aircraft, and 7 Su-25 aircraft. It also included 9 MiG-23 aircraft and 4 MiG-29 fighters. 15 IL-76 transports followed, along with 17 civilian airliners. Saddam Hussein sent valuable aircraft to Iran because he expected them to survive there. They did survive. Iraq lost control of them. Throughout the 1990s, Iran rejected Iraqi demands for their return and cited $1 trillion in claimed reparations. Inside the shelters, ground crews stripped parts from aircraft that had survived the campaign. The coalition destroyed 141 Iraqi aircraft in the air or on the ground. It also damaged or destroyed 63% of Iraq's hardened aircraft shelters. Before the war, Iraq had fielded the world's fourth-largest air force. After it, only a few hundred airframes remained. United Nations sanctions then blocked spare parts, maintenance support, and purchases of new aircraft. American and British patrols controlled no-fly zones over northern and southern Iraq. The surviving fleet stayed on the ground. Crews removed usable components from one aircraft to repair another. Maintenance stopped. The shelters filled with machines that could no longer leave them. About 300 aircraft remained after the Gulf War. They deteriorated year after year under the sanctions regime. Parts disappeared from their engines, avionics, and airframes. Without maintenance, each aircraft lost its ability to fly. By the time of the next invasion, Iraq retained aircraft bodies, not an operational air force. 6 weeks before the invasion, Iraq's remaining aircraft went underground beside their own air bases. Ground crews wrapped MiG-25s, MiG-29s, and Su-25s in plastic sheeting, then covered them with desert sand. Sand fell across the plastic. The crews buried other aircraft nearby, hoping the crisis would pass and the machines could return to service. The choice exposed the force's condition. These aircraft had survived the 1991 war, then spent years without spare parts or regular maintenance. They had once belonged to an air force that fought Iran for 8 years and numbered more than 1,000 aircraft. Now their crews hid them beneath the ground. Satellite images showed disturbed soil around the bases. American troops advancing toward Baghdad followed those marks and uncovered the jets almost by accident. Most were already in poor condition. Economic repair made little sense. In April 2003, no Iraqi warplane flew a combat mission against the coalition invasion. American forces entered Baghdad. Iraq's aircraft remained under the sand. With Baghdad fallen, Iraq's Air Force commander publicly asked Iran to return some aircraft. In 2003, he admitted most might be beyond repair. The dispute remained unresolved. Then, ISIS captured Mosul in 2014. Iraqi forces faced collapse. Iran returned some aircraft, but reports conflicted over which machines came back and their condition. Plastic sheeting clung to aircraft dug from Iraqi desert sand in 2003. It marked the end. For 6 decades, Iraq bought Soviet and French aircraft, including MiG-29 fighters and Mirage F1 jets. Maintenance received too little attention. Pilot training lagged behind the cost of the machines. Commanders could not adapt their air power fast enough. Against an equal opponent, the fleet lost combat readiness within days. In 2003, crews excavated surviving aircraft from the sand. Their condition made repair economically pointless.